Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Michael Green, CEO of the Social Progress Imperative, and I'll be leading this webinar today about how we can leverage data to deliver more inclusive cities. It's great to have you all joining us. And I think why don't we kick off, because it's people coming from all different places. We've enabled the chat. So in the chat, drop us a note and tell us where you're joining us from. So just kick to your keyboard. Hello. So I'm going to, hello. I'm in London, England. So pop that in the chat. So drop it into chat. Say hello. Tell us where you're dialing in from. Always love to know who we're chatting to. Excellent. We've got Miami, Florida, Philadelphia. What did you see? Chicago. Oh, so more from Philadelphia, Texas. We've got El Salvador, Cleveland, Ohio, Edmonton, Wisconsin, DC, Vienna, Virginia, I think that one was. Sydney, Australia. Well, what time of day is it there, I wonder? Excellent. Well, welcome all to this webinar. And what we're going to be doing is talking a bit more about how practitioners who are joining this call, I'll introduce later, have been using the Social Progress Index tool to deliver better outcomes for people in their cities. But just to kick things off, I think what we are wrestling with for the United States is this paradox. The economy, by all measures, is booming, yet that doesn't seem to be reflected in the lives of people. And the Social Progress Index was designed to create a measure of the real quality of life of people separate from economic measures. And we did a big study recently looking at 172 countries over the last 30 years. What we found was that 30 years ago, in 1990, the US was one of the world's top performers in terms of income. It was also one of the world's top performers in the top 10 on social progress. What's happened over the last 30 years? Well, the US is still one of the world's top performers in terms of average income, but the US has sunk to 25th place on social progress. So the US has gone through a period of uninclusive, what I might call empty economic growth. And just to illustrate that, there's just some of our most recent data. We just looked at how the relationship between income, gross domestic product per capita, and social progress. And what we see is how the US is very much an outlier compared to other wealthy countries. It's still very wealthy, but it's not delivering in terms of social progress as effectively as other countries. So the US has got a challenge that we're seeing in terms of declining life expectancy across education indicators, other health indicators, that really needs to be challenged. And city leaders are very much at the front on the front line of this, delivering for their citizens. And so that's why I wanted to focus this conversation on how you can leverage data for change. But just to kick things off, I've asked my colleague Rebecca Arpadian, who's one of the people who put together our new US social progress map, covering the 50 states, 500 cities, and 32,000 neighborhoods across the country, to give us a flavor of how this maps out across the country. Because, of course, an average number for the US hides a huge amount of regional differentiation. And so having a look at the granular detail of what the social progress story is in the US is very important for framing this conversation. Becca, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, so what I want to do today is walk you through some of the insights from our platform. So, as you're saying, we aren't seeing equitable, sustainable, inclusive social progress like we want to see in the United States. We're going to start at a state level and walk you through some of the highlights from our platform. So we're going to show you a series of charts, look a lot like this. Median household income versus social progress index. And so what we see a lot of is sort of what we might expect to see. The trend of higher income is higher social progress, lower income, lower social progress. But that's not always the case. So what we're seeing here is the state level. Each point represents one state. And I want to start with the highest performing and the lowest performing states. The highest performing is Massachusetts, with an SPI of 62, and Arkansas is the lowest performing with an SPI of about 48. This follows the trend we might expect to see, where the high income, high score, low income, low score. But when we look at this a little bit more detail, we can see how this starts to differentiate. So comparing Arkansas again to Louisiana, which is a state with a very similar median household income, we can see quite a difference in SPI score, 48 to 52. So something that Louisiana is doing with their available wealth is corresponding to better social progress outcomes than Arkansas. Another great example is comparing Vermont and Texas. These have virtually the same identical median household incomes of about 67,000. However, their SPI scores are very different. So we've got 59 versus 51. So we're seeing Vermont utilize their available resources in ways that produce better social progress outcomes than Texas is doing. And this is our 500 largest cities in the United States. And again, we see a very similar trend, median household income, social progress index. As household income goes up, social progress index goes up to a point, starting again with our lowest performing Camden, New Jersey, and our highest performing San Ramon, California. We see this does follow somewhat that trend, low score, low income, high score, high income. But again, it doesn't tell the entire story. So a great example of this is comparing the city of Champaign, Illinois to the city of Miami Gardens, Florida. So in Champaign and in Miami Gardens, we have very similar median household income, but very, very different social progress indexes, right? So Champaign, Illinois is about a 61 social progress index, whereas Miami Gardens is about a 39. So what we're seeing here is something in Champaign is happening where they are better utilizing their resources, the available wealth to them that is producing better social outcomes, right? So we're seeing economic data doesn't on its own explain social progress outcomes. Moving on to our most granular level, we're going to look at census tracts. So we've chosen Alabama and Alabama specifically to look at. So what you're seeing here is each one of these dots represents a census tract or a neighborhood. And again, we see that same sort of trend. Looking at the lowest performing census tract in Birmingham, we've got a SPI of 33 versus the highest performing of 61. But then we start to get a little bit more granular and a little bit more detailed, and we can compare these two high income census tracts. We've got the highest performing census tract is about $30,000 less in median household income than the richest, more modest performing census tract in Birmingham. So what we're seeing here is that income doesn't necessarily mean you have better social progress outcomes. And then the last two I want to look at are these. So again, we're going back to the lowest performing census tract, which is census tract 29. And we're going to compare that to census tract 130.02. We have very, very similar median household incomes and yet a very different social progress outcome. We see 46 versus 33. So I want to keep these two census tracts in mind as we transfer over to our web platform. And sorry, the Zoom things get in the way. So here we have our web platform, and this is all the census tracts in Birmingham. We're already zoomed in on the city of Birmingham, and we can see visually the lighter colors represent the lower scoring census tracts, and the darker colors are the higher scoring census tracts. Visually, we can see that the Northwest performs poorer than the Southeast, excuse me. So I have selected here those two same census tracts that we were just looking at in the chart. And I'm going to go ahead and view the full data for locations. So we're going to take a look at these scorecards. Starting with the demographics, again, we see it's a virtually same median household income between these two census tracts. We see a pretty similar poverty rate, and then we see a very similar race distribution as well. So these, demographically speaking, are very, very similar to one another. Going back up to social progress scores, we see the difference in those scores. And as we go through our scorecard, we can start to narrow down what exactly it is that is going on different between these two. So with the red dot, we see underperforming indicators and dimensions. With the yellow dots, we see performing as expected. And with the blue, we see overperforming. So a good example of where these two census tracts are differing would be this water and sanitation. So for example, this census tract that's performing better in social outcomes has more distance between them and hazardous waste sites and wastewater sites. We see better access to basic knowledge. We see better access to information and communications, and we can go through the scorecard and compare and contrast all of these. So one final thing I want to do before I hand it back over is show you one of my favorite features of the map, because I don't know about you, but I do not know my census tract number. But I do know my address. So we are able to type in addresses and take you down to street level. So this would be my census tract here, and compare it, visually compare it on a scorecard to what's around me, neighborhoods, census tracts, and take a look at what my scores are in my neighborhood. So with that, I think I'm going to pass it back.
Great, thank you, Becca. We're all looking forward to coming to see you very soon. We've all got your address. That's fantastic. Congratulations to Michael Ruth, who's found the question and answer function. So that's the first thing. Chat is not enabled, but if you've got a question, put it into the chat, Q&A, and we will try and answer those as quickly as possible. Michael was asking, could we give an explanation of how SPI is calculated? I think we'll not focus on methodological questions of how we calculate social progress index now, but one of my colleagues will drop a link in to the US social progress map into the chat, and we've got a full methodological note explaining how social progress index is calculated. Now, the data is one thing, but it's useless unless it's got people to take it up and use it. And one of the great exponents of using the social progress index to drive change in her community has been Katie Calvada, who we worked with for a number of years in Orange County. Katie runs an organization, Advance OC, which is using innovation and strategic philanthropy to address inequities in Orange County communities. Katie, we started working together during the COVID period, and you built the OC equity map using the social progress index methodology. Tell us a bit about how you've used it, especially, we'll start off talk about the health equity issues you worked on.
Yeah, so I am very happy to be here. Once again, thank you, Michael, and the SPI team for including us. We love being part of the SPI family here at Advance OC in Orange County. For those who are from abroad, Orange County is a tiny little suburban county in Southern California. We are about 40 miles south of Los Angeles. And in our application of the SPI, what we were able to do is understand the relationship between all the various things, the data and the metrics that SPI captures, and we're able to tie it to vulnerabilities, particularly at the time, to COVID vulnerabilities. And when we were able to then visually depict the relationship between social determinants and health, it was a light bulb moment during the pandemic. And we were able to correlate that to a strategy with the Orange County Healthcare Agency to stand up vaccine pods and testing sites all over the county, prioritizing those communities that were most at risk, were most vulnerable, not due to just underlying health conditions, but all of these various different social determinants. So we looked at housing and housing overcrowding. We looked at areas that have high poverty or monolingual communities and things like that. And we were able to detect those vulnerabilities and connect it to our efforts on the ground during the pandemic.
It's so striking that, I mean, that discovery that you made, that underlying social inequities were at least as important as underlying health issues in the impact of COVID, was quite striking. So it's not just about the individual, it's about the health of the community as a whole. Now, I mean, part of the way you've been doing this work has been around sort of the connections, bringing people together across sectors. So how does data work as a bridge builder?
That's a great question. Orange County is one of those very, I guess, very purple areas in terms of our political ideology. And so we have people who, obviously come from different parts of the political spectrum. And we were able to successfully use data to highlight issues that we all kind of have in common as human beings and residents of this shared space called Orange County, and having that be the driver right, of how we are engaging with the community was really well received. Because at the time we were all fighting against a common enemy, so to speak, right? And because we were able to do and launch this product during the pandemic, it was a very coalescing tool. And then after that, we were able to figure out from other partners in the community that, hey, we could use the same tool and the same methodology to look at things like economic injustice or education inequities, or social determinants of justice. Those kinds of things are out of the box pioneering efforts, but utilizing this common concept of being data driven, equity oriented, and community centered.
No. It's fascinating that way that, and we've seen a number of ways, the way that data can be that way that brings sectors together, allows collaboration. And I understand that you're now looking at, you were looking at social determinants of health, and now you're looking at social determinants of justice.
Yes, and that we're very excited about that. We were outreached by a legal aid nonprofit in town, and we feel very strongly that we know that there are different legal outcomes for different people in our community, and we thought, what if we could pull data from the courts and from other places to be able to investigate this further and see how we can visually depict this, how we can present a case for the same kind of correlation between social determinants and legal outcomes. And we're excited to be able to have a partner who is serving communities, underserved communities in Orange County, who are going to be joining us, and we're going to put together a steering committee and a data advisory committee of a lot of thought leaders in the justice system and in law to be able to help us along this journey and really tackle these structural issues that lead us to disparate health outcomes, but disparate legal outcomes as well.
Wow, this is awesome. It's just these different ways it can be applied and the way you can pull data in to do different kinds of things. Katie, thank you so much for now. Hopefully we can come back to you in a bit. Thank you. Keep the questions coming. We'll try and answer them either by text or some of the technical questions. We'll try and fold some of the others into the conversation. One of the other communities we've been working with has been the city of Philadelphia. And so I'm delighted that Sarah Denault is joining us, who worked with us on through the Controller's Office, a very different kind of partner and user to Advanced OC, I hope you don't mind me saying, the Controller's Office. So Sarah, how is this Philadelphia Social Progress Index useful for a controller? You're just on mute.
Sorry about that. That's a very interesting point. The role of the controller in Philadelphia, it's an elected position, and it's to be an independent fiscal watchdog of the city. So under Rebecca Reinhardt, the former controller, she resigned to run for mayor and unfortunately came in second. But the focus of our work really was, first of all, good government, and also transparency in a way that allowed data to be accessed both by city departments and by the public. And I think oftentimes we have pretty good data in the city. We have pretty good public data sets, but they're almost impossible to use if you're not skilled in, data wrangling or using statistical software. So SPI was an amazing tool that we came across. My boss and I, we comprised the entirety of our unit. So we had a lot of work on our hands, but for a long time, we wanted to try to develop a kind of a model to measure the welfare of the city, but also how well the city was spending and targeting its money. And we know, as data nerds, how differently social conditions can be just at the census tract level. And that's especially true in Philadelphia. It's a very segregated city. We have done a lot of work around redlining and the impact that that had on our city, and it's still true today. So I think in our role of trying to ensure that city funds were being spent in the best way, SPI offered this amazing ability to be able to track so many different metrics, but and do it in a way that was accessible by both city council members who are also maybe not so well versed in data but can navigate a map, and to constituents who can use this both as validation for their experience in their neighborhoods, and as evidence when they are trying to fight for their own issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the thing when we first created the Social Progress Index about 10 years ago. You know, when we came at it, the idea was that the data exists, but it's often very hard to find. It's very disparate. And actually, for policy making, decision making, you need to be able to summarize it in a simple form. So I always sort of say Social Progress Index is not a data product, it's a grammar product. It's bringing this data together. And a few people have asked about data sources. All information about the data sources is on the website about where that comes from. So just tell us a bit more about how the tool has been used in Philadelphia and what else could be done with it.
Yeah, so we developed our own map. We worked closely with Rebecca and the rest of the SPI team, Emmanuel, to create an interactive dashboard that we thought would be, easily accessible to the public. It has been very well received by departments across the city. You probably can assume that the controller's office is not a friend of many people in the office or in the city. I mean, we audit everybody, so we're kind of we're not supposed to be everybody's friend. But this has been a really good tool to reach across the aisle in many ways. City Council has been very interested in it. Public health has been using it to identify areas where they need to target certain services and their funds. And we have been able to use it. I mean, again, we do a lot of work around criminal justice issues and certain economic issues. We've focused a lot on gun violence and city spending. So in Philadelphia, our spending has increased by 50% since 2017. It's gone from a $4 billion budget to a $6 billion budget. And in the meantime, our homicides in 2021, it was the first time that we went over 500 homicides. We reached 562 homicides. So we have always thought it's, our role to keep track of those things. And in our data analysis of city spending, we've been able to overlay a lot of the metrics that SPI offers in our reports, which adds a really nice depth to things. And again, I think adds a lot of validation for people that are reading these reports and seeing the issues in their communities.
Yeah, it's the way they can really sort of bring those issues to life for people is so important, and then help the decision-making process. And one of the other cities we worked with in the past was in San Jose, California. And I know that Mayor Liccardo there talked about trying to shift spending away from those who shout loudest to where the need is. And I think data can really help to guide that. And also on the political point, I think trying to measure the outcomes rather than the inputs. Because often we have the political debates more about the inputs than the outcomes. There's a lot more consensus about the outcomes than we think. Great. Sarah, can you please? Did you want to come back on something?
Oh, no. I mean, I agree. I mean, again, like our city, I think, especially with the influx of ARP funds, we have found ourselves with an influx of cash regardless of COVID. It's amazing how much, I mean, we have never had this much money ever. And I do think everybody really wants to help, but when the money is spread so thin, because so many people are trying to achieve so many things, and don't have the data to know where to target the funds, nothing really gets done. So I think having this tool will be so, so helpful in the budgeting process and deciding where to target funds. Because I mean, I experience it every day. People are really tired of it. And I mean, it's crazy that we are in the best cash position ever. And, you know, we have the biggest open air drug market in the world in Kensington. I'm not sure if everyone is aware of that. KNA, it's Kensington and Allegheny. It's the largest open air drug market in the world. We have a crazy homicide rate. So I think this will be extremely helpful in helping to target funds. And I also think that being able to compare to other cities will be really helpful. I think there's a lot of rhetoric in the national media that demonizes urban life, and I don't think that's helpful whatsoever. So I think it's very helpful to have this data to show that we are succeeding in a lot of ways. It's just that maybe we're not spending our money in the right areas. And there are people that have been disenfranchised for generations that need some help.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah. I've asked my colleagues to maybe drop into the chat a link to the Philadelphia Social Progress Index map and also the OC Equity map. I think it'd be good for people to see those. So one of my colleagues to do that. And now I'd like to welcome Marcia Thompson to the conversation. Marcia is a lawyer by profession, focusing on civil rights, but who also has an extensive set of experience covering academia, law enforcement, business, and is also on the board of directors of Social Progress Imperative. Marcia, welcome to you as well. You work a lot with cities. You've worked a lot in cities. You work with businesses. Yeah, how can a tool like the Social Progress Map help to the challenge of building justice and equity within cities?
Well, you know, it seems like Katie, Sarah, and Becca said most of everything that I was going to say. However, I would say that for me, it would be goal setting. When you're looking at, for instance, I'm in the Midwest, and we just recently got a new mayor, and that mayor put out a strategy. And that strategy has at least 7 or 8 of our indexes immediately listed: education, housing, public safety, and so on. And so when any public professional is looking at where do I align my money, where do I align my goals, and what data am I using to justify that to the public, I think the indicators that we have from SPI allows them to have a baseline. You know, some cities will have some data. They may have good data on literacy. They may have good data on housing. But do they have the ability to overlay those together and find out where those gaps are and where those most needed communities, most impacted communities, where they have 6 or 7 of the social determinants all in one area? And I think cities could really, really use that as a value add when they're focusing, as Sarah and Katie said, when they're focusing their budgets. When you have a budget allocation concern, and you want to justify why you're putting something in one place over the other, our data can at least help you at the macro level, and then very much at the granular micro level, identify those most impacted communities. And I love the comparison aspect too, because not only can we compare those most impacted communities with multiple social determinants, the exact same ones, but we can also look at the ones that are outliers, which I think Becca mentioned early on. You can look at communities that may be economically disenfranchised, but still be an outlier where they have a great education system. And if we look at that community and say, well, they're under the poverty line, but it seems like their kids are scoring higher in education. And then we go in and find out why and use that example. So I think that's what Sarah just mentioned when you do comparison, but even within your own city, you can do a comparison just with the baseline data that we provide. And then of course, with the work that we do with cities, we supplement with their own specialized data, which even gives you much more flavor for city leaders. They can add their own community data that we may not have access to with our map.
Oh, this is a great point. This is why I loved the couple of neighborhoods that Becca shared in the presentation, was how, one was doing so much better. So it actually shows what is possible. Yeah. And it's so we're not victims to income, that even within the resources we have, we could be doing a lot better. And so I think
Absolutely.
It's not about seeing problems, it's also about seeing solutions, which is so important. Marcy, I need to ask you, given the sort of specialization you have around safety, justice, crime, law enforcement, how do you see the tool working in that? Because obviously health, education, that all sounds like very nice, fluffy social progress sort of stuff. But when it comes to crime, law enforcement, etc., do you see this as a tool that's got an application?
Absolutely, Michael. When you're looking at law enforcement and public safety, and particularly now in the 21st century policing era, police are doing more than just law enforcement. And there's a term out there, a co-production of solutions and problem solving. And so when you're looking at data, that's going to be the framework even for our justice sector, instead of just laying it down to law enforcement specifically, but even our public first responders in general. They're going to be looking at what are the other things that are indicators in those communities that are causing higher violence, more trauma. Right now, there's a huge push nationally for violence intervention. Violence has been considered a public health issue in the United States. And so when I think Katie had mentioned something about working in public health and now looking at a justice indicator, it's because they're very much a correlation. The American Physicians Association, APA, I believe, even said that when you look at inequities in communities from health and other disparities of social determinants, it also connects to violence. And so when you're looking for law enforcement, some of those communities that they're going to be focusing their attention on for violence intervention, there's also going to be interventions necessary for other social determinants, such as housing, such as food insecurity, such as health disparities. When you address all of those things holistically with your police, with your community partners, then you create a much more healthy community in general. And so when I say healthy community, I'm not talking about physical health or mental health or doctor health. I'm talking about thriving, resilient, healthy communities. And so that's why public safety is one factor in a healthy community. And these other factors definitely will help officers when they're going into those communities to be more resilient and more resourceful and to work with their law enforcement partners.
I mean, you talked about that holistic perspective, and speaking as a recovering bureaucrat myself, one of the problems we have is that often we break functions out by different departments of government, and we end up with these silos or these separate sliders, when actually the solution is going to be around tackling a number of different problems. And this unpacking social determinants of crime or health, etc., is trying to bring that integration together. And that's, again, what the Social Progress Index map does, is it brings together those all the different aspects that you might not be interested in health, you may be interested in law enforcement, but by having that contextual data together, it helps you to get that bigger picture of how it works as a system. Marcy, thank you, Marcy. Guys, Katie, I'd love to bring you back just to reflect on what you've heard around the goal setting. I'd also love to know whether or not Advanced AC has been working with the Controller's Office in Orange County.
Well, our project is a public-private partnership with Advanced OC and the entire county, the County Board of Supervisors. So we are working with all different agencies and offices, and so that's the beauty of being able to be tied to the governing body for the county. I definitely think that in this day and age where we have funds available to tackle issues around public health or public safety or other measures of social progress, I think it behooves us to make sure that we're creating the impact that we're seeking, right? And the dollars that we're investing in our communities are actually showing a change in the community. I think the biggest gripe that people have about their government or their local government is that, we're not, hitting the issues that matter to people. And this is the crux of the Social Progress Index, is measuring those exact things that matter to everyday people. The word thrive was used earlier, and I think for a lot of communities, thrive isn't even in their nomenclature because everyone's just trying to survive. And when you have communities that have those kinds of disparities and inequity, you can't really move forward to the foundations of well-being when you don't have basic needs covered. And so we need, as a community, to say, we have to create a baseline for our citizens and our residents. And that baseline has to be meeting all those basic human needs. And then together we can thrive as a community, right? And if we're not solving for those things, and those basic needs are public safety and health and education and those kinds of things, and nutrition and and housing, and if we can't provide those basic things, how can we look at ourselves and our children and say that we're setting you up for success?
And this also has a knock-on effect. I mean, we work with this on the Social Progress Index with Michael Porter from Harvard Business School. He joined the effort more than 10 years ago. And one of the things he said when we started this work was that all his work on competitiveness had taught him two things. First of all, that economic growth doesn't always lead to better lives. But also, secondly, the long-term economic success is built on strong social foundations. So actually, this is about not just doing the right thing, being philanthropic. It's actually about investing effectively in the foundations of sort of the future prosperity of your community and your city. Because if you allow the social progress to lag, it's going to undermine your economic competitiveness as well. And Kate, you've been doing some work on that as well, haven't you, on the economic side?
We have. We're trying to map out, as a result of the pandemic also. We also saw winners and losers in our communities, businesses that were shut down as a result of the pandemic, and those that were equipped or had the resources to survive. The PPP loans, where did they go? Where did they end up, percolating in the community? So we saw a lot of real-time, disparate, allocations of resources that obviously had a big impact in community wealth. And so we're going to tackle that issue as well in this coming iteration of the equity map. And when we talk about doing an Orange County equity map, it's about covering all of those different sectors and not just health, even though we started with health, but the wellness of our community cuts across multiple lanes, as you know.
Sarah, I think Kate was talking about this question about the taxpayer dollars and the accountability for those. I mean, obviously, from your experience of control, that's so important. Is that if that deluge of money that you described earlier isn't spent well, doesn't lead to the outcomes, then there's going to be a backlash against that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think obviously no one doesn't want to have more money. I mean, we're very happy, I think, as a city to be in an improving state. During the recession, we were in a very bad state where we couldn't even pay our workers. We have gone through a lot of fluctuation in terms of gentrification and white flight and disinvestment, and again, the redlining issue. And it seems like the city is starting to recover. But with this influx of money, it was so important for us to keep track of it. I did a series of reports on the PPP loans, where they were going. And I think it's interesting. Almost every map that we make of Philadelphia looks the same. Every crime map, the SPI map, the funding map, they all look the same. They are all in the same areas. Sometimes where the funding's going, but often where it isn't, where the crime is located. where the lack of funding is, where the poverty is. I mean, we have the highest poverty rate of any major city. And every single map looks the same. So with this influx of dollars, it was very important for us to we tried to influence the administration to have an actual plan for this money. We got over $1 billion and they made no plan, unfortunately, and they still have no plan for the money. And unfortunately, under ARP, it's very easy to kind of shift money around there's not really any strict rules against, if you put money in this fund, you can shift it to this fund. So it's unfortunate, but I think with something like SPI, I think it is really an accountability measure to make sure that projects that are being deployed are actually working, and that we can change these maps, and that these areas of our city are not just constantly depressed, because that's the reality of it.
And also, I think we found with this tool is it can highlight things that aren't on the political agenda or on people's priority list. We did some work with a foundation that was working in Fresno. And one of the things our data highlighted to them was the fact there was a huge problem with preschool education. Now, that hadn't risen up their list of priorities. It wasn't on the political agenda. So it was kind of being ignored. And actually, as a result of that, they said we actually made a grant to preschool education. And that's the kind of impact that we're very proud of, that using a tool like this can do.
That's amazing.
No, and that's why I think the data can highlight those things that aren't necessarily on people's radar, or people think the issues are, especially people very judgmental about deprived communities and say this is what they need, when actually what people need is something different.
Right, exactly.
I just want to just to wrap up. I think we talked a lot about kind of government, a bit about party. I just want to talk just quickly about connections with business. I mean, Katie, you've been connecting with businesses as well as government organizations. Just tell us about how that collaboration can work. And then I might come to Marcia and ask you about business collaboration as well. But Katie,
Yeah.
first.
Well, I think oftentimes when you talk about public policy, you don't think of business as a stakeholder automatically. You definitely think of community. You definitely think of nonprofits and other people. But I think when we think about building a successful, thriving community, we have to bring everyone to the table, and business has a role in it. More and more companies are being very, very community centric, and they want to respond. They want to tackle the issues that plague the communities in which their employees live. Right. So it's a very central part to a lot of business, in the mission of a lot of more businesses. And so we're finding that data definitely resonates with business stakeholders. They love to look at data, and they love to for us to give them a strategy that's data centered and evidence based. But I think the trick here is to have businesses lean into their voice and their role as a stakeholder, a true stakeholder in the community. And that's something that we're going to pursue more and more, because we do feel like the ecosystem is better when everyone participates. And that includes businesses and all that they can offer to the conversation.
No, and often they have an appetite to do so. Marcia, we first connected with you when you were working in business. So
Yeah,
in this conversation.
Yeah, I was going to say Katie and I are definitely twins when we think. But yes, that was exactly what I was going to say. I know from the perspective from when I've been in different companies, our perspective changed over the last, I'd say 10 years, but definitely in the last 5 years. Businesses in general have focused more on social justice and wanting to be a part of the solution, and having the data to show that our bottom line is impacted by the communities that are interrupted by different issues of social justice. It impacts those communities. It also shows that you're a good steward, you're a good shepherd of what you're providing to your communities. And I love what Katie said, which is one of the lines we've used previously in other roles, is where our communities impact our employees. We want to make sure those communities are safe and sound. for the employees that we have globally, as well as in the immediate areas. But I would also add that here in the Midwest, where I reside, there are community organizations in the last 3 years that have come together, almost identical to what Katie said, and have collaborated actually on specific social needs, and have worked with the philanthropic and the community-based organizations to come up with targeted goals, specifically around what we would consider adverse community experiences. I know most people are familiar with adverse childhood experiences, where you have trauma-informed approaches for children, but there are now adverse community experiences. And so our community leaders, our corporate leaders, and our philanthropic leaders have come together to come up with some pillars that they're going to address. This data, I think, would be phenomenal for them to look at, so that they can align all three of those principles and focus it on data. So the benchmarking and the measures of success, because if you don't have a benchmark, you're going to be unable to measure what success you've made. So I think that there is definitely a correlation across all three.
Well, great. Thank you, Marcia. Now I want to bring in Arturo Franco into the conversation. Arturo is a Senior Vice President of the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. Full disclosure, MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth has been one of the funders of the US Social Progress Map. So Arturo, thank you very much. But you're not here for that reason. You're here because MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth has been pioneering data for inclusive policymaking for a number of years. You developed the Inclusive Growth Score. Thinking what you've heard in the conversation, what could we learn about how can data be more powerful in driving change in cities?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, everyone. I think hearing the stories that Katie, Sarah, and Marcia are telling us from different parts of the US is very inspiring. I think when policymakers, when local decision makers are setting the right objectives and also have access to the more sophisticated tools and maps like the SPI, good things can happen. And it actually took me back, Michael, like 5 years ago when I joined the Center for Inclusive Growth. It was a time you might remember in the US when opportunity zones were being created, and I was touring the country and asking local decision makers about inclusive growth, and I would get blank stares because inclusive growth was not a thing. They knew, how to measure jobs, they knew how to measure growth, they knew how to, attract businesses, but there was this notion that you couldn't see more, that you couldn't look into the distribution. And what's happened in the last 5 years, and I was lucky enough to see it firsthand, is that equity became an actual policy objective. It became an imperative. And I think the notion was there, and Marcia just mentioned, the idea of social justice has been there for a long time. It might have not been the priority, but it also might be the case that there was no data to action on it. So there are, I think, two concurrent revolutions that we've seen in 5 years in US policymaking that I hope for our friends who are from other parts of the world that they spread out. One is a data revolution. We have more data and data tools in the US than ever before, and a lot of it is coming from the private sector, the social sector, not just from government. And the other revolution is the equity revolution. We're seeing really innovative responses to the things we saw during the pandemic, to the things that we couldn't unsee after George Floyd, to kind of this stepping up of this equity notion in things like chief equity officers in US cities, or the type of work that we're seeing displayed here today. So when you bring those two things together, a new policy objective and then a new set of tools and data, I think I can be optimistic about those maps that haven't changed in so many years.
Yeah, this is the thing, we do know that change is possible. Things can change. The art is, how do we take the resources that are starting to flow, get them to the right places to actually move the needle on those kind of outcomes. Arturo, we're very excited about the way that this data can be used, not just by city governments, not just by philanthropic and other organizations, but businesses, but also ultimately investors. Investors are interested increasingly in these ESG priorities, a lot of concern about greenwashing and people faking the data. That's not the case with social progress data. What about the investors, the capital markets, and the role they can play in partnering with cities and driving change?
We've already seen the adoption of some of these tools, at least with the Inclusive Growth Score. We know that many community development financial institutions are using them. Some CDFIs have it, basically to make sure that the places that they're investing in are those where the need is the highest. We've seen impact investors and blended capital providers kind of gravitate to these notions of how do you measure the impact as well as the returns. I think it's slowly making its way to bigger and bigger pools of capital. Goldman Sachs is launching an inclusive growth fund as part of its sustainability funds. So, we went from blank stares when I said inclusive growth 5 years ago to Goldman Sachs having an inclusive growth fund. I think that that's quite a little journey there. So again, I'm hopeful that capital will match the places where the need is the most. Hopefully in a way that as if we learn from the past, that is sustainable and builds the resilience that Marcia was talking about.
Excellent. Thank you, Tara. We're running close on time. I want to give each of you a minute to answer a question about someone. We had a question there from Carl Nelson in the chat about how do we educate policymakers more to make better use of tools like this. So what I want to ask each of you is, what would be the best help to policymakers to help them make better use of these tools? Now, who wants to go first? Do we have a?
I'll go.
So
one, I think, is more exposure. Like Arturo said, and I think we all said that there's been a resurgence of energy around equity and around corporate responsibility in the last 5 years and definitely in the last 3 years. And so I think exposure to webinars like this, but also this data and letting people know that it exists, and then really showing them how it can be used to their benefit. These great examples we've had from different cities, but really, working with them and showing them their city. And I know I've had the opportunity to show this to a couple of people, and they went, gaga over it. So the fact that I think letting them know it exists, showing it, and then making it very specific to their city, I think that that's the best way. And then telling them how it can help them drive better finances in their city, better outcomes in their city, and better solutions with their communities that are most impacted. So that would be my suggestion.
See it. Thank you so much. Who wants to go next? Sarah.
I think there is somewhat of a data literacy issue with a lot of elected officials that I'm not sure how you overcome that, but I think by making something very accessible, like the SPI map that you guys have made and the dashboard that we put together, that really helps to bridge the gap for a lot of people. I also think a lot of elected officials, at least in my experience, tend to be very reactive to immediate concerns. And I think using a tool like this can show, especially over time. I mean, I'm no longer with my office, but we are planning, the office is planning on aggregating data over time to be able to show changes throughout in different neighborhoods throughout the city. So I think that would be very helpful in trying to communicate with people who might not be very data literate, but more visual learners, to show on a map things have, on this metric have gotten worse and better, and this is what we need to do. So I think really being able to do something over time with SPI would be really helpful.
The idea about it's not just the data, there's also ways it's presented so it's useful for people. It's so important.
Yeah.
I'm going to give Katie the last word. So Arturo, you're next.
Arturo.
Oh, Yeah, so I think, I mean, it is, as I said, a combination of innovation on the front end and innovation on the back end, right? And I think that is something that is really cool and that it's happening right now. I would say the onus is on the tool makers to make their tool, to Sarah's point, user friendly. And we've just done a short experiment where we took 8 cities with their chief data officers and their chief equity officers and their teams in 8 cities in the US, and exposed them to what we consider the new toolkit for equity. SPI was part of that. It was kind of like a reveal of the US SPI, but we had like 7 or 8 other tools, and we took that experience and put it into a report. I think the link is there. It's called Data for Equity. And through that experience, you learn, that even though you think your tool is like ready for everyone to use, it might not be as intuitive as you imagined. And so having that classroom setting, putting it in the hands of users, and trying to observe how they are approaching it, I think is a critical step here.
Yeah, it's got to have that kind of practicality, doesn't it? Thank you, Katie.
Yes. So being that I work so closely with a lot of government and elected officials, I think they need a support group. Honestly, at the end of the day, I think we need to listen, be able to listen with empathy and not judgment. I feel like they are judged every single day. And if they can have a resource where we're listening to the problems of the city or the county or the state with empathy and coming together as a community of problem solvers, right? Without judgment, I think that could go a long way. And what I would say is that now that this 50-state platform has been created, the next immediate step that we need to do in really to address equity is to make sure that we emphasize data equity. So who is not visible in your data? Which communities and which populations are still unseen? Even though we have this fancy tool and this dashboard, there are a lot of people missing in the data. And so we have to, in lockstep with offering these kinds of tools and conversations, we have to address data equity because the future is going to move right past us. And if we don't catch up to it, and we don't want to make sure that we're leaving out entire communities in these algorithms and in these machine learning tools and things like that, then we're going to be forever perpetuating the same inequities that we're seeing exist today.
That's really, yeah. And I mean, don't get me started. These areas where we know data has to improve, the issues, the populations we've got to capture. Yeah, I've got the best job in the world. I get to talk to wonderful people who are doing real things, driving change in their communities in the United States and also around the world. A quick shout out to our friends from New Zealand and elsewhere who came and joined this conversation as well. Really appreciate you joining. SPI is, of course, active in every continent of the world, but we're focused on the US today. And so, Katie, Marcia, Sarah, Arturo, thank you so much for joining us. Becca, thank you so much for sharing the tool. All information, log in on our website. You'll find more details, get in touch with us if you want a demo. And also, we love connecting with change makers. So if you want to know more, if you want to connect with others about how data can drive change, get in touch. We'd love to talk. Thank you all so much for joining. Have a great day.
Thank you.